Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever your time zone is. My name is Seth Earley, and welcome to our part five of our seven-part series, a webinar series on search and AI. And today we have some great presenters, great speakers, and we're going to talk about some of the principles that people don't really consider when they're looking at large language models. It's really the information hygiene and the information ecosystem that they're walking into, that when we start to try to deploy these things. I've been in, oops, I don't care about Slack. Slack keeps trying to launch and it's mad at me. So we might see that box from time to time. Anyway, I'm Seth Earley. I've been in this space for 30 plus years. I don't want to say that, man, it kind of dates me, but that's the reality. We've been around for decades. I'm with Patrick Hoeffel, Sanjay Mehta, Eric Immerman. You guys want to give, Patrick, you want to start with a quick intro?
Sure. Patrick Hoeffel with Patrick Hoeffel Partners. I have been in the search space for over 10 years and a lot of software and consulting experience prior to that, from defense to startups, all kinds of things. But what I do is solve data and search and AI problems for customers.
Thank you. Sanjay.
Hi everyone, Sanjay Mehta. My role here is as an architect. I've been similar to Pat, and we've actually worked together in the past with a lot of the search leader vendors in this space of Lucidworks and Reflection and Deca from a commerce perspective. And then been with a lot of leaders in the e-commerce space, all which were making some use of AI all the way back from the early recommender days, ATG and SAP and Oracle and all those things. So excited to be presenting on this topic. It's definitely something we have been working with a lot with our customers lately.
Thank you, Sanjay. And Eric?
Nice to meet everybody. My name's Eric Immerman. I run the search practice at Proficient. So really where I end up focusing for many of my customers is how to drive outcomes with search and AI. Right. The technology is core. We have to do that, manage that, understand that on my team. But I spend a lot of my time translating to customers how that actually makes them or saves them money and why they ultimately care. I've been at Proficient for 16 years now, running the search practice for the past 10 or so. So know the space pretty well and excited to chat with everybody today.
Great. And this is a little bit of our housekeeping. We're going to go an hour. Try to leave some time for questions, but you can also ask questions in the Q&A tab. And there is, we have just one survey today, but then we have post-session survey as well. Just a few questions to get your thoughts on the session and what else you'd like to learn about. Early information science has been around, as I mentioned, for 30 years, and we do the same things that Proficient does in a lot of ways. They're a much larger organization, but we bring in senior level folks to help organizations solve these very difficult and challenging problems around information management, let's see, and we're also working with some large global enterprises. We've had a history of information architecture first, right? So when we build these systems, we look at the IA before we look at the AI. And my catchphrase that I coined many years ago in 2016, there's no AI without IA. So we're going to talk about some of the practical reality. Now, again, we've had these other sessions. So this is session 5. And so in some cases, like last session, we talked a lot about user contextualization, process contextualization, application contextualization. So how you get that information in people's hands by reading their digital body language and understanding their context and understanding their use cases and so on. And today we're really going to focus on, well, what happens when you go into a real environment and you have 15 different information architectures and you have dozens of different systems that need to be integrated, and you have a situation where you have poor data hygiene and poor content quality and so on. And the AI will not do all of it. So we also have companion articles to each of the sessions. We're a little bit behind. We have 3 articles so far, so you can look at those in addition to looking at the prior webinar recordings and slides. So there's a lot of resources, and we're always happy to have a conversation. So today, again, we're going to talk more about the intersection with business operations and, how do you do this in a way that is going to impact call center efficiency and effectiveness effectiveness, call deflection, and how this is really going to drive a competitive advantage. And of course, the theme that we always come back to is the value of data and the value of data architecture and the need for good data. So first, I have the slide up here, but there's a nice image here of a big mess. Why don't I let you guys talk a little bit about what you see in environments? So Eric, do you want to begin and talk a little bit about what you see when you hit the ground?
Yeah, so I think there's still in the marketplace, there's still at the executive levels, there's a disconnect between the promise and the reality of Gen AI, right? I think many executives have just crossed their fingers. This is one of those few things that is the easy button. And I say, just throw Gen AI in and it just works. And so the job of everybody on this call is to come in and say, not quite that easy. It can just work, but there's a lot of steps you have to put in place beforehand, right? Specifically, everything from having the right data, the right information architecture, the right governance, making sure that you've got your content secured appropriately. So I'm not giving somebody answers they can't get or they shouldn't get, right?
Right.
There's lots of details we'll go through today on this, I think, in terms of the reality of much of the content in those pieces. But where it really starts meeting reality is that I think, from my perspective, LLMs have kind of gone up that hype cycle chain, and now we're getting over the hump, and people are saying it's really easy to make a solid POC or pilot with this. But it's a lot harder to actually make this production ready. There's so many edge cases and corner cases and things I have to deal with. How do I manage that? And so where we're starting to see a lot of the organizations I work with right now talk about is how do I start both refining in the use case as well as refining in the content to support that use case so that it's not this omnibus vision of easy button LLM to solve all my problems. It's targeted solution to make or save money, effort, whatever in this area so that I can go forward.
That's right. It's there's no free lunch, I like to say. We're making up for our past sins in poor data quality. Sanjay, Patrick, you could talk about one of our recent engagements where we've encountered all of the above.
Yeah, a lot of it, especially when you're pointing this AI to your internal knowledge or your internal information, and again, making your internal information work for the model is obviously the piece that a lot of folks run up against. I think is one for sure, and I think like Eric mentioned that. The other two, just to call out is really measuring it. I think we see really understanding its impact and being able to track that, or it's tying it to KPIs and those sorts of things is just another one that we see folks having a little bit of a obstacle with really coming to agree on what it's doing, and so that's like another one that just to think about too, like the value and is it doing what it's supposed to be doing. That's
exactly. And I think this is where, again, you have to go back to what is the business problem you're trying to solve and put it in the context of very specific processes, as Eric was saying, and the content needed to support those processes. So building use cases, you'd be surprised how many organizations we go into, they've tried to do a Gen AI project or an AI project, and they have no use cases. It's like, how do you know what good looks like if you don't have a use case? You have to test it. You have to verify it. And the use case needs to be unambiguous. Sanjay, Heather and I taught a workshop on Monday in KM World, a half-day workshop on building a knowledge architecture for generative AI. Really great session. Really loved it. People really loved it. We needed a full day. So anyway, something we could bring to you. But it really, they walked away with, holy crap, I didn't know how important use cases were, and I didn't really know how to develop them. Patrick, what are your thoughts about what you see in organizations? And again, this is retrieval. At the end of the day, it's retrieval, which is search, right? Retrieval,
That's right.
Generation. Yeah,
that's right. Like you say, Seth, there's no AI without IA. There's also no RAG without retrieval. It's the first part of that process, right? Thanksgiving is next week in the United States, and it's a big holiday here. And we all like to think about what a wonderful meal we're going to have on Thanksgiving Day, a week from Thursday. But unless you make sure all the ingredients you're going to make are in the refrigerator or in the pantry, if you haven't done the preparation to make sure you have all the food that you need in order to get it cooked and on the table, you're not going to have the kind of experience that you hope. And what we see in the AI and search world is no different. If you don't have the documents in your index or in the pantry or the refrigerator, so to speak, they're not going to be there when you go to take them out and put them on the table. So I hate to use the age-old garbage in, garbage out, but if you don't have the data well curated at the beginning, you're not going to have a well curated result at
a large language model, that you bring that content into a vector space. You don't need to know all the details, but suffice it to say that many times the entities, the metadata, the structures, the classifications are very, very different. There's multiple ways of doing this. So, different concepts are called the same things, concepts are called different things. And then you find when you try to federate across these different systems, you have all these mappings to do, right? We have to harmonize and standardize these things. So in the recent project category was collection, was group, was product type. So how do you get a terrible experience when you don't resolve that? Now, this is from a survey we did on Gen AI this year. Organizations are still doing all these POCs, right? Very few are really in production. And the POCs, most POCs don't get to production because it's very difficult, as Eric was saying, to have those production conditions. It's easy to curate and fine-tune your data and your information for a POC. Well, now try deploying that to production. It's a very, very different situation. And it's interesting, there's still a lot of companies that aren't planning for RAG. Maybe they didn't understand it, but some are using it internally, and some are very few are using it externally. A lot of pilots, as I say. But it's interesting to see that in our survey, and we could break this up according to industry, there were fewer plans for that. And of course, proof of concept, but we are seeing things in production for some of the organizations. We build proof of value projects, and the proof of value are things that can be deployed at scale because they're using the production data and they're showing where all the challenges are. And of course, data quality is a big issue, lack of expertise, lack of business case, which is really interesting. And of course, budget, there's never budget when there's no business case, right? So you have to have an ROI and you have to have a business case to get budget. There's budget available if it's going to save the company money. But there's a lot of cases this leadership isn't there. And then this final slide, or this final couple of slides on the survey was really about what are people interested in and what kind of content do they need? And really a lot of this, one of the pieces we didn't show here were that executives want education. So doing briefings is very important for executive leadership. So when you see any kind of a service environment, we have lots of information silos, but we can federate that. We can cross-link, we can link the sources. A lot of times we have poor taxonomy, so we can build classifications, build semantic search, dynamic facets, and so on. A lot of times there's inconsistency, so we need to standardize, we need to unify this. And then, of course, we have multiple steps and processes, and we need to be able to actually do things in the application rather than, or do things in the search environment when we're retrieving. And again, what I'm finding is that with retrieval augmented generation says generative AI is very good at interpreting a question and in making a result more conversational. But it's really about the ability to retrieve your information. Eric or Sanjay or Patrick, did you want to talk a little bit about some of these things, some of these obstacles in processes and experience?
I'll jump in first. So we see these in the real world all the time. I'll give an example, and I won't name names or anything for obvious reasons, don't have their permission, et cetera. But we do a lot of work on my team for one of the largest software companies in the world. Right? They make thousands and thousands of products, multiple versions of them. There's complexities out the wazoo here, right? As they've started deploying generative AI, one of the core problems has been matching their data with the context of the user. And I believe we've chatted about context of the user before, and that's something that we kind of can know and understand, that we have to understand, how do I reset my password changes depending which piece of software I'm in, right? There's not one answer for that in an organization of this size. But what they find is that, their different experiences have different information architectures than their different content silos, right? And so this company has 7 different names for every product. Is it the product number? Is it the product ID? Is it the product num? Is it the full name? Is it the, interpreted name? Is it the code name, right? And if the information architecture of the front end experience knows the product name, the full name, but the back end data knows the product ID, well, it's hard now to filter and align, only find information for this type of product for this customer, right? And so they've had to do a huge amount of work in normalization and using semaphore and other tools to create data mappings that kind of run in real time and everything on this. For something that, I mean, to most folks who aren't technical, this seems like a relatively trivial, obvious, common sense problem, right? But when you get to this scale and this type of organization, it's a massive thing that you have to start working through to actually make all of these pieces talk to one another.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Sanjay, did you want to talk a little bit about that? I just moved on to another slide just to kind of illustrate that all of these things are information retrieval mechanisms. And as you go up in functionality along this continuum, you have to rely on more intentional and a more sophisticated information architecture. And that was what you were just talking about. The things that people think are obvious or no-brainers are very complex in practice. Sanjay, Patrick, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, if we think about like just the outcome that the user wants or the business wants, right? And what we usually see is that they want to avoid, the amount of effort or number of steps that it might take to find information, for example, and looking at like a generative response, right? And for example, where they bypass the need to have to actually go to a document, for example, that it was a source. And if I just even use that example, if you're using multiple sources, right, how do you bring that together, and what's that understand that information need of that user, and how do you, like Eric brought up, sort of that normalization, how do you get that standardization across all those sources to get the right answer, whether when it's combined, right, or commingled from a couple of sources. So that's like another just something to think about, and why you need a lot of this IA as part of it. Yep.
Yeah, and when we have this proliferation, I'm sorry, Patrick, did you want to add to
No,
that?
I'm good.
Yeah.
I'm good.
So when you start looking at these organizations that have many, many tools, a lot of times they are bolting on a tool when there's some problem with the experience, when in reality, they needed to revamp the information architecture. So search sucks, let's get a new search tool. Collaboration is terrible, let's get another collaboration tool. Our content management system doesn't work, let's get another content management tool. That is not the problem. So there's a proliferation of applications and systems with overlapping functionality, and sometimes they're just not fit to purpose, right? So we have a challenge with those types of things. When we are looking at the measurement, it's very difficult to things like measure across these different systems. And many times the organization isn't instrumented for the right level of measurement. And of course, we keep talking about data quality. When you have these multiple tools and people have to swivel chair into different systems, they are wondering, well, where do I get the most up-to-date stuff? Is this the right version? Is this the right version? And I like to say it's not necessarily information overload, it's filter failure, right? We're not personalizing. If we don't personalize things and we don't look at their role and we don't look at prior interactions, the user's digital body language, it's difficult to anticipate what they need. So what we want to do is understand that user journey and then be able to anticipate what they need and surface that information. So you're kind of understanding what their patterns are, and you're looking at who they are, and you're just like you could read someone's physical body language, you're reading digital body language. And the more you know about your customer, the more you can do that. Let's see, we have a raised hand. Here's one. Within all this content, are you able to make so many things look like what they want? Quality and clarity content is vital. So within all this, you are able to make things look different. Well, the point is they have to meet the user's expectations. Right. So the whole point here is that we have the ability to understand their expectations. I didn't really see a question in there, but if you do have a question, put it in the Q&A if you would. Thoughts or comments on this? Again, this is what we typically see in an organization when we walk in the door. Patrick, your thoughts?
Yeah. So to the point in the chat, there are two ways at the end of the day, whether or not a user gets what they're looking for is the determination of whether or not they're happy with the result. And there are two ways to solve that problem. One is to dig into what is it exactly that they need, and that's really important as a consultant to be able to have that conversation and ferret out exactly what it is that they expect to see. But on the other side is to create the expectations for what they're going to see, so that, and it's the easier way to solve the problem, to set the expectation on behalf of the user and say, this is what you can expect to see, and then to satisfy that expectation because you know what you're going to deliver. And somewhere in between discerning what they expect and then creating that expectation as well, those two have to come together in order to create a satisfying user result. But
absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the comments in the chat was, can you use an ontology to resolve those naming conventions? You can if you apply it, right? The big problem is you're not applying it. So this is where inconsistent governance comes in, right? There's standards out there, but they're not enforced, right? So yes, you can use an ontology, but only if you apply it. A lot of times there's no content lifecycle, so documentation becomes stale. So if you have old, outdated content in your repository and you're trying to get an LLM and Gen AI to access it, again, the retrieval part is what has to be fixed first, because if it can't retrieve the right piece of information, or there's too many, too many haystacks, or too big a haystack, and your needles all look the same, right? You're not going to be able to get exactly what you want. And of course, not having the metadata, not having the standards, not applying it makes it difficult to reuse content. It makes all of those things more difficult. Now, PDFs can be great, but they're not good for answered questions. A 300-page PDF document needs to be componentized and made more accessible through chunks to build question answering systems. And then in this particular organization, there were a lot of manual processes that were inefficient. And then they had lots of different authoring sources and tools, and allowed 1,000 flowers to bloom. So there were 1,000 standards, right? 1,000 different ways of doing things. Sanjay, Eric, Patrick, what are your thoughts? Sanjay, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I mean, one use case we just kind of recently went through was, looking at the PDFs, for example, and the ability to be able to inject metadata within those docs, right? And some of the remediation piece there, I think is kind of interesting, so that you're not throwing away kind of some of this, but you're adding the metadata so that when you're looking at retrieving it or presenting it in AI, you have that additional context, right, to make it usable. Maybe like versions even missing, but now we have a way to add version in there so that it is usable. For example, I would say it's like one that we came through, and that could be facilitated by like what we've been doing a few times, but is facilitating some of that metadata generation using these models, right? And that could help sort of in the publishing process for sure, right? Whether it's a form of enrichment or remediation. So that would be the part of it, but also having the model like evaluate the content itself to understand where it believes the gaps are for, for example, a specific use case. So kind of tying that back together would be, some of the experience that we've had here.
Eric, thoughts?
So I'm gonna take a slightly different angle on the further part of this that we see having a major impact, and that's giving the business users or those authoring the content visibility into what is being used, how it's being used, and the ability to influence relevancy when it is being used. Right? Fundamentally, when we talk about this space, when we talk about search, a lot of it all boils up to feedback loops. Right? How quickly can I get feedback and integrate it into my process to do better next time? Right? Over and over and over again. And what we often find is that in many of these systems, those who are authoring the content, managing the silos, managing the systems are kept separate entirely from the experiences that are being generated off of that content. And the problem there is fundamentally what it takes is it takes the team that's building that experience to find issues, to fail, to report them back to the business. The business says, all right, why do I care about this? What are my KPIs? How am I aligned here? Maybe they fix something, maybe not. And you have this slow evolution of things getting better because there aren't directly aligned incentives between those who own the content and those who own the experience. The way we try to solve that frequently is to bring the content owners into the process of this AI experience early and show them, look, we're making your content more valuable. We are helping you get better. And part of that has to not just be the process of bringing them in early, but it has to be systemic processes. Can I give them analytics on how their content's being used? Right? Ask any product owner at any major tech company, the thing they love most, it's hearing from actual customers, because they so often spend their life in a bubble, unable to understand what the people in the real world want. If I can bring that closer, that's a really big benefit. So analytics, interactions there, the ability for those content authors to not just change the content, but also potentially affect the relevancy algorithm to say, you know what, our descriptions, they're always junk right now. I know in this system, this wiki system, people just type in random characters to get the you must enter value here, right?
Yeah.
Make that a smaller part of your embedding. Make that a smaller part of your ranking algorithm for your lexical search, whatever you're using, right? But our titles, they're great. This field is great. We need to have that there. And so giving those content authors agency into this whole process ends up being a critical part of actually moving this needle fast here towards actually getting better content in the shorter term.
And those are great points, Eric. And one of the things that someone said in the chat was, what are the AI interventions? And the AI interventions are numerous, right? But they're not going to do it by itself. We have some approaches for doing data cleansing, for doing data enrichment. What we are also doing is harvesting information architecture, organizing principles, building taxonomies, auto tagging, and a classification of content. So this whole life cycle can be improved, but you need a reference data source. You do need a mechanism to create the content, author the content, ingest the content, tag the content, access the content. But again, it's all comes back to that content. But there are many AI interventions, and we can set up a separate meeting and talk about those because we have some tools and some reusable code. We have modules. We have something called the Virtual Information Architect, or VIA, which we are productizing and making available to organizations. But again, these are the things that are required before we can effectively pull this out. And we find that, there's 30 to 50% of the time in many different organizations, reps are spending on unnecessary searches for their content. And for one organization that is a long case study that's been around, it has been documented that they have saved $50 million per year. Supplied materials made into a Harvard Business Review case study. And the idea of being able to do that at scale is what, I was saying that a project that cost $1 million a couple of years ago could cost $100,000 now. And, here's the other piece. These are processes. Many times it's the usage of the tools. It's the attachment of articles. It's business participation, right? There are all these things that are also part of this process. This is interesting. My animation didn't work out, but we can't find our content. Well, where do you keep it? In collaboration spaces. Well, that's why you can't find it, because collaboration spaces are great, but you can extract the information. But if you're just trying to find stuff, they're usually pretty messy. But we can use natural language processing, and we can use large language models to extract that information and then bring it into a repository, be able to review it, edit it, vet it, approve it, and tag it and post it. This is just a view of all the different metadata that was these three different systems had the same types of content, and they had vastly different metadata structures. I know that's an eye chart. It wasn't meant to be read, but we have to we harmonize these sources. We have to be able to understand them. And again, part of what we can do is use AI in order to remediate the data and improve that data quality. So here's an example of Microsoft Teams, and it's not a knowledge repository, but people are working around it as a knowledge repository. But in fact, what you can do is you can build in a process where you can ask Copilot to create, in the example of Copilot or whatever the LLM, you can ask it to create a knowledge article based on a conversation, and it can create a very good piece of work from that. Then it gets submitted with a particular status, and then you have the ability to start to put that through a workflow process, make it available, make it usable, make it retrievable, and monitor the status, and then pull it into the process. So there are ways to use these collaborative workspaces, but just like you would not try to collaborate in a records management system, you wouldn't manage records in a wiki, right? They're just different purposes. And you have knowledge creation and problem solving, which is a relatively chaotic or creative opportunistic work, creative authoring process, right? That's where we get creative, and we do those in these other types of systems. But then we have control processes, which is really about accessing, retrieving information. So you have to think of it this way: make the punishment fit the crime, use the right tool for the right purpose. But you can get around some of these things, and you can leverage some of these unstructured collaborative spaces by using large language models and by harvesting that information. Thoughts on that, guys, before I move into, I'm going to move into maturity next, but I'm just going to talk about these. But what are your thoughts about collaboration versus knowledge reuse?
I mean, I'll take a step, but just the one thing we keep hearing around is this idea of like tribal knowledge and it like information loss when resources, turn over, for example, right? And or you have new folks that you're onboarding and they don't have like the sort of the great onboarding information available to them, right? It's kind of some kind of use cases there and like you've shown here, it's like how do we make it easier for the folks who have that knowledge or that tribal knowledge, to make it shareable or capture it in the first place and make it shareable. So I think that's just the important piece. And how can, definitely how can you use some of the AI to help with that, to make it easier, less friction to do that for sure. It might be multimodal, right? Sometimes it's
Right.
through voice. Voice is like a great one or, historical interaction data would be another one too, like
Yeah.
cases and chats and things like that.
Absolutely. And harvesting that knowledge where it's created is so important. And a lot of times, meetings, just recording meetings, doing doing the transcription of those meetings, feeding that into an LLM, getting a summary, getting an article. Those are very, very good use cases for your GPTs, for your chat GPT types of applications or your internal GPTs, whatever you're doing. Before I move on that, were there any other thoughts, Eric or Patrick, you had on that whole idea of, the collaboration on the one side of the screen and then the reuse on the other side? Whoops, here it is. This one.
My major thought is that this is a concept that makes sense as we look at it in architects and play into it and try to plan around it. Realistically, though, this is almost an impossible conundrum to solve technically because you're talking about trying to force user behavior to change, which often is trying to push a boulder up a hill through sludge that's never
And
going to happen. And so
I think that's the point, though, is that what we're saying is that you have to meet users where they are. You do have to do some change management. You do have to do some process improvement. You do have to enforce some standards, but it is like water going downhill, right? It's gonna avoid the
it's going to happen either
obstacles.
way.
It's going to happen, right? So even though we have the situation, we can try to, what we want to do is build a process for harvesting that knowledge and then bringing it into the system where it's
Right.
easier to access. And
You
so
know, to carry a theme from earlier, when people say I can't find
Thanksgiving
my
dinner? No, I'm sorry. Carry on.
exactly that. When people say I can't find my stuff, it's like you put the food on the table and they say it doesn't taste good. Well, the time to fix that isn't after it's out of the oven. I mean, you can put on some salt and you can put on some gravy, but at the end of the day, what you really need to do is plan better at the beginning and do better preparation and find better ingredients and make a better menu. And all of that goes into the process of getting it to the point where it goes into the oven, because once it comes out, there's not as much you can do. And so it's like blaming the oven or the search engine for the fact that you can't find your stuff. Well, it's not really its fault. You didn't give it much to work with. So
Yeah.
so I want to emphasize the importance of the pre-work, the preparation work, preparing your data, preparing your documents, preparing your indexes so that they can then do the job that they're so good at the end of the day, and you get a better result.
Absolutely. So it is multidimensional, right? And that's where
It is.
we come back to, well, where are we trying to have capabilities? Knowledge management. First of all, this was a current state. I'm not giving you the actual maturity because that has proprietary information, but I'm going to show you a model. But you can assess all these different areas and say, what are our capabilities in these areas? And you look at the different systems and you have to understand, well, what are the maturity levels of the systems? And so it's kind of a 5-point, you get this from a lot of different things, demos and surveys and usability and content analysis and workshops and interviews. But this is one of the maturity models. This is updated with the actual dimensions that are important to the customer. And then you identify, well, what does a level 1 mean and where do we have to be, right? Because you might be starting at 2 or 3 in some areas. Maybe you need to move to 4, maybe you need to move to 5, maybe you're at 1 and you need to move to 2 or 3 for your process. how long is that going to take, right? How mature are you, and how well are you doing things today? So there's usually a current state maturity and then a future state maturity, and it gives you a nice visual of where you are and where you need to be and how big those gaps are, right? So that's just a model, but it's helpful. Now, we talked about metadata, and we talked about inconsistency in metadata and taxonomy driven vocabularies. This is the same, these are different compressors, but in these cases, they have the same feature, right? Refrigerant type, coolant agent, and coolant. Those are really the same thing. And then in the values, there are three different values. So it's NH3 in one system, it's ammonia R17, 717, and in others, NH3 R717. This is what it's going to look like when you don't have the right harmonized metadata. But then when you do, there's one value, refrigerant type, there's one value, refrigerant, right? So that's remediating the metadata field itself to cross map and to harmonize and to normalize the metadata structures and to harmonize the fields themselves. So maybe these are going to become non-preferred terms, right? So if you're looking for NH3, you map it to NH3R17, whatever the preferred term is. You map it to that. It becomes part of the thesaurus structure, part of the ontology. So again, when we're trying to do these things, and this is an interesting one. I was talking to a CFO. I probably said this before. Why do we need taxonomies, ontologies? Why don't we just Google? I said, do you have a chart of accounts for your finance organization? Of course I do. Well, why don't you just get rid of your chart of accounts and just get Google? Because the taxonomy is a chart of accounts for knowledge, right? Because again, you can't just throw everything in a box and expect the LLM to figure it out. You have to label your entities. You have to label these things. So when we need an exact result, we need the structure. LLMs are statistical. Deterministic is saying I have a clear final answer, but we don't necessarily always get that with LLMs. But when we use retrieval mechanisms, then we can get a deterministic value. So there's a lot of things that are holding people back. It's, not being able to control the technology, loss of control of what employees are doing, not understanding how to apply it, providing tools that have uncertainty, unsure if investments pay off. What do you guys have to say about these things? Because I think there's an answer to all of this, right? Eric, do you want to start?
So I think all of these are very true. And what I've seen for how to actually get past these for a lot of organizations is to continue, but put some better process and structure on what they're already doing. As we saw in your data before, Seth, there's many organizations that are doing pilots. They're dipping their toe in the water and trying it out, right? But those pilots don't go further than pilots many times because that's seen as, this is a hard problem to solve. Right? I come from a computer science background. In computer science, I would say the number one lesson you learn as a computer scientist is how to break big problems down into small problems that you can actually solve. Right. There are a lot of people who don't come from that discipline, and thus they see a big problem, they get overwhelmed by it, and they say, I'm not doing it anymore. Right. That seems tough. We're going to step back. Right. What we've had to do with our customers who have started on the pilots and then gotten to that freeze stage is say, okay, this is good. You've got learnings. There's been success out of this pilot because we have verified that there is some beneficial outcome that can be driven here. Right. So next stage is what small steps do we take next to make it a little better? Right? Can we get it to just a couple of internal users, maybe 3 contact center users who can start giving us real end user feedback as opposed to not? Can we set up this iterative innovation approach where essentially the plan is to build another pilot, another POC on top of the existing pilot for a feature or an improvement that will be better, and to iterate this thing through to production, right? Each step essentially has clear success and failure conditions with it. Right? And failure isn't considered a failure of the program. It's considered a failure of that step and the learnings that we've gained in order to set the next step that we're going to go through. What we've seen is that at large organizations that tend to be more risk averse, right, tend to be more process driven just because they've got so much going on. They've got to have process to constrain how things happen. The ability of them to pivot and start setting up more of an innovation mindset internally, even if it's 10% of their team, focuses on working with the business to build pilots or POCs that the business can then turn into formal user stories for the tech team to go and build into the real product or the real outcome. That ends up being immensely helpful because what it helps people get past is all of these fears, right? The way to debunk these fears is to see it and understand it and realize how it's going to work. And customers struggle to do that without a lot of investment a lot of times. And so we tend to take this bite-sized approach, an iterative approach, in order to get them to move along with this in a small investment way to debunk many of these fears as they move towards the bigger solution.
Great. And I totally agree with you on that. The fact that doing these things in proof of value chunks where you're showing value, you're setting up specific use cases, you're defining what good looks like, right? There should not be a mystery here, because to do these things without use cases, to me, is just mind-boggling. What does success look like? What do you want this thing to do? And map those out and define them. And you end up defining hundreds of use cases. And use cases are classes of tasks. So one use case can represent tens or hundreds of actual tasks, right? Because you change variables out. And so when you're creating these use cases, they become an exhaustive representation of what the organization does and what these different roles do. Patrick,
Well,
did you have any?
and let me add on to that real quick, Seth, just based on the reality we see is that many of these organizations, they'll have a use case more globally, more broadly, right? I want to improve customer support. IT says, okay, you want to do this, write up some requirements. We'll go build it. And then inevitably the requirements get written. IT comes back and says, there's a lot of gray area here. What do you mean by this? And the person thinking up the use case says, I don't know. I've never done this before. I've never built a Gen AI agent before. And we're at a space where this is new technology to most everyone. And so the iteration can help the people saying, I don't know, to try and start to know, because now they've seen it, they've felt it, they've touched it, they've used it, which can solve that process problem down the line of IT saying, what should I build? Even if you're giving me a use case, how is it narrow enough for me to build?
Well, that's true. And that's what we find, is that many times when you go through the exercise of building use cases with organizations, they're too ambiguous, right? They are too vague. They're not testable, right? We want to have something that is a very clear activity that someone can do or not do. Will the systems provide it or not? And we have a whole methodology I think we've gone over in other sessions, but it just talks about step by step how you ask those questions iteratively, right? How do you keep breaking down and deconstructing the process to get to the point where somebody has a task where they need a particular piece of content? And then how can they do that? Is it doable? Is it unambiguous? Does it have a clear outcome? And when you write vague and ambiguous use cases, people are going to say, well, what do you mean by that? Because it's too ambiguous and it's not testable. When you start building them in those, starting with scenarios, and people call them different things, tasks, use cases, scenarios, use cases, tasks, it really gets down to that level of detail and nuance. What are people doing? Patrick, did you want to add to the thinking?
I just wanted to comment that I think this might be one of the most important slides of the whole deck, and one of the most important topics for all of you on the webinar listening who are trying to understand how to translate this Gen AI capability to the stakeholders in your company. You will be successful to the extent that you're able to overcome, first identify the fears that are at work inside your organization, and then addressing those directly, and then overcoming them by breaking this big scary thing down, like Eric said, into smaller things until you get to a small enough piece that it's accessible, that it's achievable, and that you can draw results from. Being aware of the fact that this is still a very scary thing because it's so unknown, paying attention to that can help you to drive adoption in your organization.
Sanjay, any other thoughts?
I would say what we see less in enterprise use cases versus, I would say, consumer facing use cases is the idea of like the split testing. I think when we talked a little bit about being able to measure or instrument on these use cases. So, when we think about even in like digital touch points from a consumer perspective, it might be more where you're going on a less riskier use case where it might be something like improving data versus interacting with the consumer until you've proven it, right? But all the whole way you're measuring or split testing or benchmarking it against something. And I think that's something I would implore folks to start doing if you're not already, is start instrumenting and trying to get some benchmarks so that you have something to compare against, because that is something we see lacking for sure.
You have baselines, but as we say, we want to instrument. There's a lot of knowledge gaps. Many times organizations don't have visibility to departmental processes that cut across different parts of the organization. And we go in and map them sometimes, and people go, well, I didn't know how that happened in the other part of the organization. And then there's visibility to these things for the first time. We need to understand a process and understand where AI will provide value. Where is it going to give you new data, better data, faster data? And of course, we don't know what the content quality is. We don't know what the data quality is. So many times we have to go in and figure that out. And we've also said this over and over about measurement of the outcome, and there's lack of understanding around the role of these good practices for information architecture and information management are. And getting a handle on the data. What do you want users to do? What's going to change them? What is that future state going to be? What becomes part of their experience? What becomes part of the back office process? We can't have acts of heroics upstream and expect a seamless experience externally. But where are you going to have that intervention? Where are you going to make that change to the organization? We have a quick poll here. It's we usually do these toward the beginning. So the question is, do you anticipate using generative AI to augment customer facing, back office, or don't know? So back office, it looks like so far, not clear. A few customer facing. So yeah, a lot of people are doing back office, which makes a lot of sense. AI is increasingly being just integrated into the systems that you're using. You're using AI, you may not know it, right? Because it's already part. Using search uses AI. Looks like a lot of folks are looking at this back office from the back office perspective. So I'm going to just end the poll quickly here because if you have one more to try to do it, okay, now we're sharing. So again, a lot of people back office, which is great, right? Because that's where we need to begin the process and be able to understand. One person was saying why I couldn't choose both customer facing and back office. That should have been a multiple choice, or we should have had another choice in there. So that was our bad. And we've seen this. We've seen content operations costs significantly reduced, customer support efficiencies significantly improved. Reductions in time that people are looking for information, call deflection, all these types of things, and they translate into real money. This is an article I think I showed last time, but it's just a good reference to say that it's starting to get more business awareness. People are starting to see more of this. And when you see it in the print version of the Wall Street Journal, it's starting to hit more mainstream. So one of the things that we offer is we offer a 3-week knowledge and AI assessment. It's really educating people. It's looking at the business cases for Gen AI. It's looking at the metrics, key factors for readiness, looking at business analysis, and then coming up with a roadmap for generative AI proof. Should be, say, proof of value. We didn't update that terminology, but that's something you can take a look at. There's a URL for that, and we'll give people 20% off of that assessment if they schedule an appointment before November 30th. And then we also have a half-day workshop. That could be a 2-1-day workshop. What is generative AI and how do you build a knowledge architecture using Gen AI tools? And that was the workshop we delivered this week in Washington, D.C. I know we have a few moments for questions. So if we have any questions, why don't you either put them in the chat, put them in the QA, or we can finish things up. But final thoughts from our panelists. Patrick?
I guess I would just double down on data preparation is the key to a great outcome. So I'll leave it there. And happy Thanksgiving.
How about yourself, Eric? Final thoughts?
I would agree that, the sentiment of garbage in, garbage out makes sense here. What I would say, though, is that more properly defining the problem space and taking the steps to make sure you're refining down to exactly what's needed can help target in where data needs to be most improved and be used as a accelerator for actually making change in that data cleanup process.
Totally agree. When you get that user journey down and you look at those use cases, you're going to say, at this point in this process, that's where I need the data, and that's where I'm going to focus on fixing the data. You can stack the deck for yourself. You're going to go up to the attic and organize all the old newspapers, from the last 10 years that are sitting up there. You're gonna look at what's timely, what's relevant, what's appropriate, what's valuable, and a knowledge intensive process or use case it's an information leverage point, has a lot of downstream impact. It'll speed up other processes. That's what you need to look at. Sanjay, your thoughts, final thoughts?
Yeah, but I think it's like a great time now, like to break the status quo experience. Like just to think about it doesn't. You can inject Gen AI everywhere, but there's ways to even have for example, like information retrieval type applications be a whole new, like have a whole new form factor, right? Like yeah, of course conversational is like a big one, where it's bi-directional now, and I think that's just like really exciting, when we think about like getting information where it's you're having a conversation with your data versus kind of a one way that it's traditionally been, and to take that into account, and your users are probably right. Your users are already probably using some of this outside of work too.
Yeah.
It's just kind of making it more familiar is I think something to think about.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the big thing, the distracting shiny bit is that these LLMs can answer questions, but that's not the value. The value is using them to answer questions about your data and your information. That's where your competitive advantage is. That's where you're going to lose the hallucinations. That's where you're going to speed up the information metabolism of the enterprise. And so, with that, we'll leave you. And again, we have our virtual information architect, which will be soon made available as a software as a service. But we're happy to talk to beta customers if you want to try some of these things out. It's going to be an end-to-end process where it ingests content, derives taxonomies and ontologies. There's still human judgment needed, but gives you the building blocks of the content models, and then can iteratively process hundreds of thousands or millions of documents to componentize, to tag those components, and then ingest into a CMS. It's really that whole end-to-end process. It's being built, so some of that is aspirational functionality, as I like to say, but you guys can give us some food for thought if you try these things out, and if they can help with your business and help automate some of the things. And that half day to 1 day workshop is a great way to train your team in these foundational principles and be able to then go back and apply them yourself. Or, if you need help, company like Eric's or my company, we can all help you. Sanjay and Patrick and I work together. So let us know, and we'll be happy to schedule an appointment to catch up and talk about these things. So with that, I'm going to give you 2 minutes back to your day. And you use it wisely, and we'll see you next time. And I really want to thank Sanjay, Patrick, Eric. Thank you so much for your time today. And thank you for Carolyn too, for the work that she's doing. Yes, you will have access to the recording, and you will have access to the slides. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.